The consequences will be very serious. If I don't come to the Kremlin soon and appear live next to you, the army will turn its weapons against the Kremlin. A serious bloodbath is coming, and this isn't a joke.
And don't try to push us into thinking that Boris Vyacheslavovic is organizing this process to drag us into war. Listen, the President of Russia and I have discussed this topic 1,000 times. How can we fight against Ukrainians?
Against the backdrop of ongoing massive attacks by Ukraine deep into Russian territory, a real mutiny has erupted within the ranks of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Russian soldiers are allegedly ready to turn their guns around and storm Moscow, just as Yevgeny Prigozhin once tried to do. A video message from one of the servicemen of the Russian armed forces has appeared online, in which he stated that he is merely relaying a message from the top leadership of the Ministry of Defense and the Russian army. And if he is not granted an audience with Vladimir Putin, this Russian serviceman, together with his comrades, will march on Moscow. Well, dissatisfaction among Russians is indeed growing. In particular, the fuel crisis in Russia continues to expand, and both official and unofficial restrictions on fuel sales have already been recorded in at least 83 regions of the Russian Federation, as well as in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Volodymyr Zelensky has stated that the Security Service of Ukraine is launching a 40-day influence operation against Russia to force an end to the war. The point is that the SSU is beginning 40 days of massive strikes against Russia. Meanwhile, at the annual NATO summit, which will take place on July 7 and 8 in Ankara, the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance are preparing to approve 70 billion euros in military aid for Ukraine. Taking this money into account, the total spending on Ukrainian defense, both domestic and external, is roughly equal to Russia's military budget for this year. Meanwhile, in Belarus, under the influence of the Russians, military infrastructure is being built near the border with Ukraine. Zelensky said that Minsk has already been given signals that this needs to stop. Nevertheless, Belarus is trying to provoke Ukrainians to go into the forests on the border, which are mined. The Belarusian Border Committee stated that it is ready to provide simplified passage for Ukrainian residents into Belarusian forests, supposedly for picking mushrooms and berries. But this could amount to using people as a human shield for military provocations. But suddenly, the Belarusian dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, publicly demanded that the Kremlin not drag Belarus into the war, and for the first time, publicly admitted that Putin is indeed pressuring him to do so. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss the latest news. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. So, let's start with the hottest news. A video message from one of the Russian Special Military Operations soldiers has gone viral online, in which he addresses Vladimir Putin directly and claims that the Russian occupiers are preparing a real military mutiny. In just the first 4 hours after it was posted, this video got more than 3.5 million views and over 125,000 likes on Instagram. In the video, the Russian occupier covered in medals claims that on June 24 and 25 he allegedly met with officials, including top officials from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation and other security agencies. According to him, they gave him a message for the President of Russia. Quote, "If he doesn't grant an audience live on air, I will tell the whole truth about what's happening in our country right now." At the same time, this Russian occupier did not specify why the officials from the Russian Ministry of Defense chose him for this mission.
June 25, 2026. Today, a representative of the Servant of the People Party came. Yesterday, I met with people who are representatives of high-ranking officials from the Ministry of Defense and law enforcement agencies. And they delivered a message to Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin that if he does not grant an audience in live broadcast, I will tell the whole truth about what is happening in our country right now. At this moment, dozens, hundreds, thousands of our soldiers are held in punishment cells, punished by their commanders. They are sitting, rotting, subjected to torture and violence by the so-called Gestapo, for refusing to follow stupid suicidal orders, for refusing to give up their freedom. These are financial resources. And in the end, they are erased, made to disappear without a trace. Vladimir Vladimirovich, please pay attention to this. Invite me to see you. The consequences will be very serious. If I don't come to the Kremlin soon and speak live on air, the army near you will turn its weapons against the Kremlin. I'm just delivering the message. That's all I have.
It was eventually revealed that the person in this video is Alexander Lunin, a soldier from the Voronezh region of the Russian Federation, who took part in the invasion of Ukraine and runs a blog on Instagram and other platforms. In another video, this same occupier, Lunin, states that this is not a bluff, make no mistake, and if something happens to him or his family, quote, it will be a signal to start taking action. Who supposedly came to see him and delivered a message for Putin, the blogger of course did not say, but he did say that he is ready to tell this only to President Putin and only live on air. But what he wants to talk to Putin about, who he is and who supposedly spoke to him from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, he did not say.
My friends, a very serious bloodbath is brewing, and this is no joke at all. If Vladimir Vladimirovich shows some common sense now and responds to the messages from the military, the security forces, and those people who came to see me yesterday, then this can be avoided. If not, I think there will be such chaos in the country as has never been seen before. Because the external enemy is not sleeping, he sees all of this. And of course, he will use all of this for his own purposes. If the guys who are now on the front line leave their positions, our country will collapse. You must understand the most important thing. We have nowhere left to retreat. I have put my whole life on the line. I'm not the leader of the resistance. I'm the one whom Vladimir Vladimirovich heard.
And here I want to point out that all this looks like an attempt by a deranged Russian occupier to draw attention to himself, nothing more. After all, his address came out exactly on the anniversary of the Wagner Group mutiny in 2023. Let me remind you, on June 23 and 24, 2023, Yevgeny Prigozhin's militants staged an armed march on Moscow. It all started with statements from the owner of this military company, Yevgeny Prigozhin, directed against the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, which was regarded by the Russian authorities as an attempted mutiny. And Prigozhin also led his militants toward Moscow to talk with Vladimir Putin there, since supposedly he was not being heard by the Ministry of Defense. Well, in general, right now it looks like just another SVO participant who lost his mind and decided to attract attention this way. As for me, that's all there is to it. But the discontent among Russians is still growing. That should be acknowledged. The fuel crisis in Russia continues to expand. As of June 26, official restrictions on fuel sales across the entire region have already been introduced in 32 subjects of the Russian Federation and in the occupied territories of Ukraine. If we take into account local restrictions, that is, in individual cities, districts, or settlements, then official restrictions are already in effect in 43 regions and occupied territories. In total, both official and unofficial restrictions on fuel sales have been recorded in at least 83 regions and occupied territories of Ukraine. In fact, there are almost no regions left in Russia that haven't been affected by the fuel crisis. The most common restrictions are a ban on selling fuel in canisters, as well as a limit of 20 liters of gasoline or 80 liters of diesel fuel per vehicle. In addition, in several regions, there is a limit of 200 liters of diesel for trucks along highways, and some areas have introduced priority supply for government services, agricultural enterprises, and critical infrastructure. The fuel situation is worst in the occupied territories of Ukraine. In Crimea and Sevastopol, there is a complete ban on selling fuel to the general population. In the occupied Donetsk region, gasoline is unavailable at many gas stations. Where it is available, no more than 20 liters are sold per person. Selling fuel in canisters is prohibited, and diesel is issued to special services by voucher. In the occupied Luhansk region, gasoline is also sold in amounts no greater than 20 liters per person. In the occupied part of the Zaporizhia region, there is a limit of 50 liters of fuel per refueling. In the occupied part of the Kherson region, fuel is available only with coupons. It is chronically in short supply, and disruptions in deliveries lead to the suspension of public transportation. And you know what's the funniest thing about this whole situation? Almost none of the regional leaders in Russia cite Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries and oil depots as the cause of the crisis. Instead, governors and governments of Russian regions explain what's happening by, quote, restructuring logistics, changing supply routes, high seasonal demand, or even placing the responsibility entirely on the gas station networks themselves. They say it's the gas stations themselves that are to blame. And it's paradoxical, but most Russians actually believe this nonsense. They see the strikes on the oil refineries, but they say, oh, it's just logistics being disrupted, or it's just the season, it's summer, so everyone's buying up gasoline, that's why there's a shortage. No, don't get me wrong, it's not because Ukrainian drones are burning oil refineries to the ground. Here's an interesting statistic. The Russian publication Kommersant, based on reports from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, calculated that since the beginning of 2026, the armed forces of Ukraine have launched nearly 40,000 drones into Russia and annexed Crimea. According to daily reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense from January to June, more than 39,000 Ukrainian drones were intercepted and destroyed by air defense forces. On average, that's about 6,000 per month, and in the incomplete month of June alone, this figure has already reached nearly 10,000 drones. And in recent months, Ukrainian forces have focused on striking oil infrastructure, which has led to serious consequences for the Russian fuel market. And as Reuters reports, citing industry sources, the shutdown of several major oil refineries, including the Moscow and Tenneco refineries, in June led to a 25% drop in gasoline production compared to June of last year. Currently, only up to 85,000 tons of gasoline are produced per day in Russia, while summer consumption is at least 110,000 tons. So, in other words, production doesn't cover 20% of the demand. But it seems that this is just the beginning. The security service of Ukraine is starting to compete, launching a daytime influence operation against Russia to force an end to the war. This was stated by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. The head of state spoke about the results of the report by the head of the security service of Ukraine, Yevhen Komara, on the plan for long-range sanctions, medium-range sanctions, and the results of the Alpha Special Operations Center at the front. Next, I will quote the Ukrainian president. I approved a 40-day influence operation by the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, against the aggressor state to force an end to the war. For several consecutive months, it is the SBU that has shown the highest results in defending Ukraine's positions on the front thanks to various types of drones. The Alpha Special Operations Center is the leader in terms of losses inflicted on the personnel and equipment of the occupying forces. But in this situation, the Kremlin is trying to open a new front from the territory of Belarus. Zelensky said today that military infrastructure is being built in Belarus near the border with Ukraine. Here is a quote from Zelensky. The acting head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine, Ole Luhovsky, reported on the implementation in Belarus under obvious Russian influence of measures to prepare for a potential expansion of aggression against Ukraine. Along the Ukrainian border in Belarus, the construction of road infrastructure and storage bases for ammunition and fuel and lubricants is being completed. They have no other purpose except for military use. We're talking about the following border sectors: Kobrin Koval, Ivanovo Manevici, Luninets Sarny, Rechica Korosten, Homel Chernihiv. We know that in Russian documents this is described specifically in the context of the so-called special military operation. Well, Zelensky also pointed out that Belarus has already received signals from Ukraine regarding such activities and about all other forms of their collaboration with Russia aimed at prolonging or escalating the war. Another quote: "Belarus knows what steps it needs to take for peace. The development of border infrastructure for aggression from Belarus must be stopped. Steps toward de-escalation and peace must come specifically from the Belarusian side." And against this backdrop, the Belarusian Border Committee, followed by the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko, unexpectedly announced that they are ready to provide simplified access for Ukrainian citizens to Belarusian forests for mushroom and berry picking. But the State Border Service of Ukraine said that, indeed, the practice of allowing Ukrainians to cross the border to collect wild berries and mushrooms had existed for many years. But that was before Russia's full-scale invasion, when its troops entered Ukraine, including from the territory of Belarus. Since 2022, neither the regular border crossings with Belarus nor these simplified ones have been operating at all. They also reminded that mine explosive barriers have been reinforced along the entire border with Belarus. And in general, to enter, stay, reside, or carry out work in the border zone, you need to have a special permit. Therefore, Belarus's calls for Ukrainians to go into the forests on the border, which are actually mined, sound like an attempt to provoke a provocation. But the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko behaved completely inappropriately in this situation. Surprised? Minsk does not intend to join the fighting against Ukraine. Alexander Lukashenko stated this at a meeting with the Russian ambassador Boris Gryzlov and the governor of the Moscow region Andrei Vorobyov. For the first time, he publicly admitted that the Kremlin, through Gryzlov, is indeed trying to persuade Belarus to take a more active part in the war against Ukraine. And now, the video of the conversation has been published by the Telegram channel Pul Pevogo. Well, this is the official channel of Lukashenko's administration. And it's obvious that they published this video intentionally to publicly show that Lukashenko supposedly, excuse my language, brushed off this Gryzlov and said that they shouldn't try to persuade us to join the war against Ukraine. And what's interesting is that the Belarusian news agency Belta, which is a state agency, even specifically clarified that these words from Lukashenko were addressed directly to the Russian ambassador Gryzlov, whereas Russian propagandists in their reports simply ignored this phrase. Lukashenko added that he had discussed this issue many times with Vladimir Putin and kept telling him the same thing: Belarusians do not want to fight Ukrainians.
We don't need to get involved in the war, and don't try to push us into thinking that Boris Vyacheslavovich is organizing the process to drag us into the war. Listen, the Russian president and I have discussed this topic 1,000 times. How can we fight against Ukrainians here, especially when it's mostly territorial troops on the other side? Are we supposed to shoot these mechanics, milkmaids, and working guys who don't want to fight Belarusians? We don't want to fight Ukrainians either. That's why our position, Andrei, just so you understand, is peaceful. But in any situation, we will stand by Russia.
We value this very much, Alexander Grigorievich.
It can't be any other way. Let's get down to business. We don't need war. We have enough land, enough economy, and enough problems. So no confrontation. There's no need to stir things up here. I'm saying this so you understand my position. I'm not hiding it. Peace and only peace.
And here I'll remind you that recently the Wall Street Journal, citing former and current Russian and European officials, also wrote about Moscow putting pressure on Minsk. According to the publication, since the beginning of the year, Russia has been seeking to use Belarusian territory for strikes against Ukraine and hybrid operations against NATO countries, threatening to stop financial support. According to sources, it is that very Gryzlov who is conducting the negotiations. And so, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, even called Lukashenko in May and spoke with him for an hour and a half, warning him against entering the war. On June 19th, Volodymyr Zelensky gave Lukashenko a week to dismantle the Russian relays that were adjusting strikes on Ukrainian cities, threatening to do it himself if the demand was not met. And already on June 24, Zelensky announced that since June 22, these relays had stopped working. On the third day, Lukashenko did shut them down. Well, it seems that Lukashenko is behaving exactly like this now because he understands where everything is heading. He didn't just say it for nothing. He publicly told Gryzlov to his face not to push us into openly entering the war against Ukraine. The fact is that at the annual NATO summit, which will take place on July 7 and 8 in Ankara, the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance are preparing to approve 70 billion euros in military aid specifically for Ukraine. Taking this money into account, the total spending on Ukrainian defense, both domestic and external, roughly matches that of Russia. At least with those that Moscow has allocated in its military budget for this year. NATO stated that, according to the rules, the draft declaration obliges NATO countries to provide Ukraine with military support amounting to 70 billion euros. By the way, the US will not participate in this program. 3 days ago, Volodymyr Zelensky signed a law according to which budget spending on military purposes, taking into account the loan from the European Union, will amount to a record almost 4.5 trillion hryvnias. That's almost $100 billion. As a result, Ukraine's total military budget for this year amounts to $178 billion. And now for comparison and understanding. The Russian defense budget allocates 12.93 trillion rubles. That's about $170 billion at the current exchange rate. Once again, Ukraine has 178 billion and Russia has 170 billion. So, in these indicators, Ukraine and Russia are now equal. Could you have imagined this before the full-scale war, during which Vladimir Putin was planning to demilitarize Ukraine? I think there's definitely something to think about here. And basically, I wouldn't be too surprised if the Russian occupiers actually start to rebel. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, I would be grateful. You can do this by donating through any of the links and details in the description of this video. By the way, there's also a link to my Telegram channel, Peachy News there. Subscribe to it as well. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Bye everyone.